Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I am really late, but to get this very interesting, what's bound to be very interesting, Bound in Friendship panel going, I'm going to just quickly read the bios of our three presenters here today in order, and then they will give their talks to us in that same order. First up, Bo Bonner is Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences. He received his BA in Philosophy from Oklahoma State University, his MDiv from Duke Divinity School. All right. Next, we have Dorian Speed. She's an educator, writer, and speaker living outside Houston. For the past 20 years, she had taught middle and high school students in a variety of settings. Is currently a catechist in her parish youth ministry program. She's been published in Dappled Things literary magazine, as well as on various Catholic websites, and contributed to the proceeds of the inaugural conference, the Walkie Purser Center at Loyola University. Did I say Walkie Percy? I apologize. Need that coffee. Okay. And last, we'll have Eve Tushnet. She's the author of Gay and Catholic, Accepting My Sexuality, Finding a Community, Living My Faith, as well as two novels, Amends and Punishment, a Love Story, which is forthcoming. She also edited the anthology Christ's Body, Christ's Wounds, Staying Catholic When You've Been Hurt in the Church. She writes and speaks on subjects ranging from men's figure skating to the epistemology of horror movies. Her hobbies include sin, confession, and ecstasy. All right, well, let's get the party started. Thank you. I'm actually going to go here so I can watch you.
Okay, great. Do you need these to tell us to be good people?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for coming to our panel, and thank you for letting me start this off, and thank you for providing coffee so that I, too, am cogent at least a little. So the paper that I want to give wants to make a bold claim that friendship and literature have something to do with each other, nay, that when we teach, we actually need to have in mind that what we're trying to do is make virtuous friendships between our students and the books and the stories they read. This is bold, and for the philosophers out there who will ding me later, I'm very well aware that what I'm doing is making an analogy and kind of seeing how far it can walk before it limps. But I think there's something to this. Now, what is the something to this? I've taught literature and philosophy, and especially what I guess would be considered great books type programs for quite a few years now, and I've always had trouble when people talk about what makes a great book or why should we teach it this way. To use a snarky term, it's at least under-theorized what makes some books great and some not. So I've thought a lot about what does it even mean to say that there's something like a canon, or why we should teach particular books or a particular host or constellation of books. It clearly can't be the case that Mortimer Adler's 50 bricks that you put up on your bookshelf to show off are all in agreement or something like this. All we have to look to is the Greeks and realize that the Greeks we're told to read that are great themselves do not all agree. So the question starts to be, what are we doing when we prescribe different books, or specific ones, I should say, and ask people, students particularly, to have their lives changed by them? What's going on? So that's what has motivated what I've done, hopefully here, to be at least compelling as a metaphor. And my question is, maybe is there something more going on than just a metaphor? Because look, a lot of people say things like, oh, well, friends read each other like open books, or people will talk about having a friendship with an author or a book. And it seems that we have a sentimental idea, especially those of us who are book lovers, that we have some sort of very interconnected, deep personal relationship with the stories we read. Just to show you, get my nerd card out here, I drove over from Iowa for 5 hours and listened to Aristotle on tape and thought that was a great way to use my time. And I caught myself driving going like, yeah, buddy, that's right. And so if you're talking to a thousands years dead man about ethics in your car by yourself, either something's wrong with me or this theory works. So I'm hoping to be defending my sanity a bit. No, but what really struck me, and at least I think this metaphor holds true, when you think about what Aristotle says about the three types of friendships, this sort of standard idea that he says, that we have friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and then whatever people want to call the third one, complete friendship, virtue friendship, true friendship, the different ways that it's spoken of, that this really starts to be an interesting way to talk about what we're trying to do when we teach students how to read. So Aristotle comes up with these three because he says the lovable is lovable for three reasons, right? One is use, one is pleasure, and then whatever we might mean by to become virtuous, right? That lovable things are good and good in themselves, and they make us that way somehow as well. And to think about if we're going to teach students about the different ways they can approach literature, it seems to me this is at least a good place to start. There is plenty of times that we approach literature strictly out of use. And so I'm not even meaning only VCR manuals for the kids out there. VCRs are what you used to watch things on. So I don't just mean like the sort of manual use. I also mean something like Alasdair MacIntyre in his the first book he wrote on the history of ethics. He talks about Homer extensively, but he's not really talking about the Iliad or the Odyssey in terms of the literary merits. He's bringing up points within the Iliad and the Odyssey to make the case about how the good was understood in ancient Greek at the time and how that changes by the time Aristotle and Plato are around. This would be reading it for use, right? You're using this as an example to make a case. Pleasure, obviously, I think anybody who considers themselves a book nerd or a lover of stories, when people really ask you, why are you reading that book? And you want to say just because, there's the idea that it's pleasurable inherent in itself. But it seems with students, we want there to be something different. The love that we hope to instill for books in students seems to be something like what Aristotle means when he talks about virtue friendships, that it's something long-lasting, that it's something that can't be done in an instance, that there's a way that we find ourselves reflected in these books, this literature, and that we try to ourselves gift this to our students because we believe their life will be changed if they approach literature in more than simply a utilitarian or even pleasurable way. And of course, everything that applies, that virtue friendships themselves are pleasurable, virtue friendships themselves are useful, but that their use and their pleasure are not the goals for which they are done, but they sort of spring from the fact that we are approaching our friend or the book for itself, for its own good. And that seems to me one of the greatest leaps that we try to teach students if we're talking about the great books method or classical education or however you might want to put this, is that the books in and of themselves are worth it. The grand waste of time, right? The non-servile reading of these books is that the good of reading the book is the good of reading the book or hearing the story or something like this. Now, if that's all I was trying to get at, you would all rightfully be mad that I'm only 5 minutes and I'd be like, oh, there you go. There's the sort of metaphor that maybe we can talk about. But being the sort of intractable person I'm wondering, perhaps that we can extend this metaphor to start to get at what are we doing when we try to get people to read literature a certain way? Is it the case that we try to make students befriend in a virtuous way certain books or literature? Now, out of the gate, there seems to be good reasons not to believe this from Aristotle himself. So, for instance, in the Nicomachean Ethics, and I'm going to be quoting from him mostly today, he makes a good point that now love for an inanimate thing cannot be called friendship, since there is no mutual loving. So seemingly, my time here is done. Thank you. No. But I have to say, so just as much as he says this, if you flip back further, even he will admit that there's a strange way in which the poets themselves will begin to treat their work like children. So this is that was from book 8. This is from book 9 in the Ethics. So he says, the same is true of craftsmen, for each likes his own product more than it would like him if it acquired a soul. So he pulls the whole Pinocchio routine. And so, even if my puppet could come to life, I would love the puppet more than the puppet would love me. But then so it's interesting already that he's imagining not only that artifacts and things that we create are sort of extensions of ourselves. This is a whole other paper and I can't go into it. But he also points out that it's like we're putting our soul into the thing, and he likens it to parents begetting children. But then he throws this one out. Presumably this is true of poets most of all, since they dearly like their own poems and are fond of them as though they were their children. Now, on one hand, I think this is just shade he's throwing at the poets. But it's interesting to think that already for Aristotle, you can start to imagine the products that we make, but particularly the literary ones, as something like having an existence and an extension of the people who've made them. I'm not acting like this is a knockdown case, but it at least complicates this idea about what an inanimate object he has in mind and how that refers to stories. The second one actually I think is the bigger thing to bring up if my analogy is going to be anything but limping, that I have to say something to it. So this is the idea that if there's going to be a virtue friendship, that third type, that it has to be reciprocal and equal in some way. So he says, moreover, in loving their friend, they love what is good for themselves. For when a good person becomes a friend, he becomes a good for his friend as well. Each of them loves what is good for themselves and repays in equal measure the wish and the pleasantness of his friends. For friendship is said to be an equality. And there's an honest question you can ask me. How can you have any sort of reciprocity with a book or an author long dead, even though in the car I told Aristotle, good job, buddy? Well, the idea, it seems to me, is that, well, first of all, Aristotle extensively talks about unequal friendships. So one of the things that I'll say in the standard model about when you're sort of like hearing Aristotle talk about friendships, people really kind of stop in certain parts of book 8 and leave it there. And you go, well, virtue friends have to be equal. And then they almost will use that as a jumping off point to talk about how our understanding of friendship has developed and changed over time. But actually, Aristotle spends a lot of book 8 and book 9 talking about the inequality of certain relationships and friendships, but how too they can be virtuous. So he thinks of God and humanity, rulers and the ruled, but particularly he spends a lot of times on families, parents, and children. Can they truly be called friends? Can there be a reciprocity and equality? And then he spends a lot of time saying, can you be friends with yourself? And surprisingly enough, if you look nearly anywhere that Aristotle talks about friendship, he will end up asking this question, can you be a friend with yourself? And he very, very much says yes, and that it's important to think so. Yet again, a whole other topic that I'm already running behind, not being able to talk about. But the point that I'm trying to get at is because he has this understanding that actually virtue friendship can at least in some way pertain to people who are unequal, he says that it must be proportional between the two, but that there can be a virtue friendship. And specifically in book 8, I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but he talks about ancestors and the fact that ancestors themselves have a possibility of a virtuous relationship with their descendants. He says ancestors rule their descendants. And he takes this sort of an analogy from parents and their children, but then goes on to discuss that ancestors and descendants have a reciprocity and a proportioned equality, the thing that he's trying to make between when people are not actually equals, how some sort of equity can exist through proportion. He often says that what the idea has to be is that if someone is in a stronger position than the other, they receive the equity by being proportionally given two different things, right? So someone who gives beneficent money is repaid an honor that's equal to the amount given to the one who receives the beneficence. So he seems to say the same thing about ancestors. Ancestors in a real way give to their progeny even after death, and what is owed by the progeny is honor because we have existence from them, etc. Now, all of this is to say there seems to be things out of the gate that would negate what I'm saying. The points that I bring up aren't stock answers that sort of shush all sort of worries that someone might bring up. But I do think it complicates the question that it's not dismissed out of hand. So I want to maybe talk about the mechanics of how this might work. If we're going to say that books operate in the model of moral formation that Aristotle thinks friends do, then what does that look like? So what do we mean here? So on one hand, just to very specifically talk about why Aristotle thinks friends are necessary for the moral life, and specifically that image I used in the title, that they act as a mirror for us. The mirror comment comes from the Magna Moralia, which I understand is disputed whether it's Aristotle or not. But in many ways, I don't care because the quote is really great. So hold with me there, and then I'll lead to the less disputed quotes. So, moreover, direct study of ourselves is impossible. This is shown by the fact that the very things that we censure others for, we don't notice ourselves doing. And this comes about through partiality or passion, which in many of us blind our judgment of what is right. And so just as when we want to see our own faces, we see them by looking in a mirror, Similarly, when we wish to know our own characters, we can know them by looking up a friend. For a friend, as we say, is another self. So that's the plainest way to point this out, that it's hard to see the moral life in ourselves, so we seek out friends of similar likeness to us so that we can see morality and hopefully grow in this other way. But it's disputed. So I got one that's not. It's a little longer and a little more convoluted than that, very precise way. But this is from the Eunomian Ethics, and it goes like this. We must therefore examine the truth, book 7, from the following consideration. Friend really denotes, in the language of the proverb, quote, another Hercules, end quote, another self. But the characteristics are scattered, and it is difficult for all to be realized in the case of one person. Though by nature a friend is most to us akin, yet one resembles his friend in body and in another spirit, and one in one part of the body or spirit and another in another. But still, nonetheless, a friend really means, as it were, a separate self. To perceive and to know a friend, therefore, is necessarily in a manner to perceive and in a manner to know oneself. Consequently, to share even vulgar pleasures in ordinary life with a friend is naturally pleasant, for it always involves our simultaneously perceiving our friend. But more so to share the more divine pleasures, the reason of which is that it is always more pleasant to behold oneself enjoying the superior good, and this is sometimes a passive, sometimes active experience, sometimes something else. But if it is pleasant to live well with oneself, and for one's friends also to live well, and if living together involves working together, surely their partnership will be preeminently in the things that include the end, or the goal, or the telos. The idea being this: a lot of times when Aristotle brings up the necessity of friends for the moral life, he's usually talking about, like I said earlier, can you be your own friend? And then this emerges into, this is why we need friends to actually love ourselves. If we can't love ourselves unless we have friends to sort of make this work. He also brings it up a lot when he's talking about self-knowledge. So specifically the Eudaimonian ethics, but he does this in the Nicomachean ethics too. Whenever he's talking about what does it mean to know ourselves and who we are, he starts talking about friends being necessary to do so, and for various reasons. Again, I have more quotes, but I realize I'm going too long. So let me push on if you don't mind. So the last question then would be, can we make a sort of, can we understand what I've said about friendship and the ethical life and connect this to what he says in something like the Poetics, or his theory of how literature works? There's two moves to make, neither of which I have time to go fully on because I talk too much. But one of them is this. The question starts to be, how does a child become brave unless they have the ability to experience bravery? Another question then is, in order for your kids to be brave, if you live in the suburbs, must you throw them into the worst part of town and say, I hope you get home, honey, and then you'll be brave? Should we drop them in the wilderness? Like, if you get home, you have fortitude now. There's this open question, of course, because for Aristotle, virtue is not right thinking, or he makes grand points all throughout the beginning of the Ethics that he's not here to tell you what to do beforehand. You can't decide the moral life before it happens. The habits are formed through time, through habit, through this long extended nature, and mostly through experience, because you have to have the experience of an event that causes the passions to arise in you. And then you have to have practice of dealing with the passions correctly. So the question is, where do kids get that? And the argument that I make is that literature seems to be a prime place to do this. I myself may have never done anything brave in my nice air-conditioned life, but certainly I can read the Iliad, the Odyssey, more modern literature, and what he says about the Poetics, right? That what spectacle and story and what everything's supposed to do in Poetics is to draw out our passions, not so that they can be purged, but purified. The idea then is we sort of get a moral education for most of our passions through literature if we don't get the chance to do it ourselves. So that's one way in which I want to make this connection between reading literature and moral formation. But I think the other is that if you start to, because maybe that's just saying, use then. Is that just a use-friendship relationship towards a book? It's useful to read these because we all can't have the sort of experiences like someone who's fighting in a battle to learn to be brave. But it seems to me that if you also look at what we talk about in, what Aristotle talks about in the Poetics, that you start to see a theme that I'm not going to be able to quote all of these, so you're going to just have to take my word for it, and I'll show you later, I guess. That the idea starts to be that what is up when we talk about poetics, Aristotle starts talking about the poems in sort of a living way. He'll say the plot or the story of a poem is the soul of the poem. And then he starts talking about the imitative arts and that the fact that we all, and elsewhere he famously says, we all desire to know, and the proof of this is the enjoyment we take from our senses. But in the Poetics, he'll point out that we love imitating. We imitate from childhood. And in one of those weird ways that Aristotle puts it, he's like, the proof of this is we'll even enjoy a really well done piece of art of grotesque things, like a dead body. And you're like, it's like, that must have been a really interesting painting you saw, Aristotle. But sure, yes. And so you start to think about Oedipus Rex or the Iliad and the Odyssey. And, I've taught these to teenagers, and you're talking about the opening scene of the Iliad. And you're like, so what's the really, why is the Iliad starting out? And you're like, oh, this is an argument about war bride slaves, kids, because a war's going on. And you hear yourself, why am I teaching the Iliad to teenagers? And you start to realize, right, they're not imitating. You don't want them to imitate the characters. Go be Agamemnon, kids. I mean, even the good ones, right? Even if you talk about this in terms of tragedy, it's not a matter of like, go be like Oedipus Rex. There's the idea of, can you be anything but Oedipus and want to know who you are? Damn the torpedoes, the human element. And so the idea starts to be, if it's hard for me to see myself except in the mirror of my friends, literature itself is not only just useful because it gives us the practice of how we deal with our passions, and it's not only that we see sort of the moral life in other characters, there's a way in which we befriend not Homer of the past. There's not this sort of genetic historic argument here. All of the ideas, is there a Homer? Is Shakespeare, Snuffleupagus actually? All these sort of things about who are these historical figures. Don't worry about that. The idea is we seem to form something like a virtue friendship with the person who has written this tale. And that the reciprocity starts to be something like, I give this person honor or the attention or whatever it might be, but what I receive in return is the ability to see myself in the sort of universal human way that what Aristotle says in the Poetics is the aim of all poets. This is where he famously dogs historians. Sorry, historians. I don't see any of my historian friends. He dogs historians and says poetry is far more like philosophy because it's not concerned with details but universals. Because whatever else poetics and literature is, it has to be about the universal aspect of humanity. That all of us, but precisely that we see this through the specificity of the characters, the nearly alien nature that each particular character demonstrates. Now, in a minute, I have to pay off the last thing that I so foolishly put in the sort of tag about what I was going to talk about. And that's why Lectio Divina might actually be served by having this understanding of friendship. All of the sort of things that I would throw out about why we can't consider literature an actual friend. It's an inanimate object. Can we have reciprocity and equality? Those sorts of things like this, at least in Lectio Divina, are all answered. The premise being that, yes, actually, when we study the word under the idea of divine reading, like the monks teach us, you aren't actually having any sort of devotion towards a book or an inanimate object, but a living being, Jesus Christ himself, who you form that relationship with. And that the goal is precisely not to use or even take pleasure merely in the life as Christ's disciple, but that we truly do have a virtue relationship with Christ through his word, both the Old Testament and the New, according to the monks. And that this also goes to the reciprocity. It is not simply a matter of what we get out of it, but if you know Lectio Divina at all, that there is an actual bringing back, that we bring honor to Christ himself through reading it. I'm sorry, that's a very bold claim that I have now run out of time to talk about. Thank you.
Can you hear me if I'm not using a microphone?
Yes.
Okay. I need to stand because I have a treat for you. which is a PowerPoint. I know how much we all look forward to this. Oh, they need it for the video.
Yep, sorry.
All right. All right, good morning. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. It's such an honor to be here. I've never been to Notre Dame, and I'm just amazed to have this opportunity. As Leigh mentioned, I am a teacher. I've taught for 20 years in pretty much every setting that you can imagine, from a extremely nominally Catholic high school in the Deep South to a homeschool co-op of the classical Catholic nature. I most recently taught at a classical Catholic parish school, and now I work as a high school catechist at our parish. So I've had a lot of experience with young people with various levels of investment in their faith. For me, I think the most rewarding is working with my high school group that I see on Sunday afternoons, because they are usually there because grandma says you have to be confirmed before you can get your driver's license or some other motivating factor. And so in that limited time that we have together, there really is no time for fluff. You just have to get down to the essence of the faith, the basic curricula. You can't tiptoe around the difficult things. And what I try to get across to them is the good news is true, and if you leave, you can always come back. Because honestly, I don't know how many of you have experience with catechesis of young people for sacrament preparation, but often your prayer is you will see them at Mass the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. And it won't just be, you're here to fill this requirement. You want to kindle that fire in them. So one of the approaches that I like to use are stories and art in catechesis, and I'm going to give you some examples this morning. I'm going to take you on a little tour of art from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and share some of that with you and talk about how we can use art and our literary imagination to have a moral discussion about the nature of friendship. So I'd like to open with a quote from the first book I'm going to be talking about. I don't want you to be alarmed by the number of tape flags on this book, but you can make some assumptions about my mental state on this basis. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book In the Time of the Butterflies. This is, I believe, the 25th anniversary of its publication. The author, Julia Alvarez, her father joined the resistance in the Dominican Republic against the dictator Rafael Trujillo shortly after the real life events on which the story is based. It's the story of four sisters, three are pictured here, who stood up in heroic resistance against this dictatorial regime. I thought it was interesting, if you were at Bishop Gujak, I hope I'm saying his name, last night, when he talked about the extra fear chromosome that people have as a result of living in these repressive regimes. That really struck me as something that could relate to this story as well. So about halfway through the story, and I have to confess, the internet tells me that these are the Mirabal sisters, and I hope that they truly are, and that this is labeled correctly. So the oldest, Patria, is one of the later sisters to sort of join the cause. And during this saga, they're not really under house arrest, but they're sort of under house arrest, and the sisters' husbands have been imprisoned. So she's talking about walking through her house. I hung my Sacred Heart, a recent gift, in the bedroom. There I offered not my trick prayers, but my honest-to-God ones. I wasn't crazy, after all. I knew who was really in charge. I had let go of my hard feelings for the most part, but there was some lingering bitterness. For instance, I had offered myself to El Jefe, that's the dictator, to do it as he wanted. but I hadn't extended the same courtesy to God. I guess I saw it as a clear-cut proposition I was making El Jefe. He would ask for what he always asked for from women. I could give that, but there would be no limit to what our Lord would want of Patria Mercedes, body and soul and all the et ceteras besides. With a baby still chugging at my breast, a girl just filling out, and my young man son behind bars, I wasn't ready to enter his kingdom. So, to build on what Bo has said and try to not be redundant, when we look at virtue friendship, what are we talking about? So this Aristotelian ideal of we recognize in one another the virtues that we hope to pursue is elevated in the Christian ideal because we are journeying together not just towards some abstract ideal of virtue, but towards a person. And the person of Christ is looking at us and drawing us to him. So that charity of pursuing Christ unites us in our friendships. It really elevates the nature of friendship. The theologian Paul Waddell says we're soldered together by the Holy Spirit. And Aristotle would say friendship is important to build up the city-state, and Christian friendship, we build up the kingdom of God. This painting of the nativity with the shepherds, I was thinking about the fact that the shepherds are the literal first pair of friends that journey together to gaze upon the face of Christ. And what a beautiful image that is of what it is that we should be doing with our friends, helping one another journey towards Christ and getting as many people to join our caravan as we can. So we don't have a formal way of establishing virtue friendships today. We can't meet at the coffee house and say, I think it's time we take this to the next level of formal kinship ties in pursuit of virtue. But I find that talking about friendship in this way, especially to young people, they have an inherent understanding. They understand what it means to have a friendship of utility because they know what it means to be used by a person. They know what it means to have a friendship centered around pleasure because that's how so many of their friendships start in childhood. And they find it really a revelation, this idea that there's value in pursuing friendship, and it's not just an issue of if all of your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it at the same time? It's not just about peer pressure bad, remember that about friendship, go out, because that's kind of the narrative with young people often is don't let your friends mess you up. But it's really empowering to say this is what you and your friends should do together. When I was teaching 5th grade, I liked to, in the 15 minutes before recess, just throw up some art and say, what you observe, let's talk about it. How can you relate this to anything that we've talked about this year? And just see what they have to say. And at first, there's total silence because there is not a right answer and she's really stressing me out. But then we have some really fruitful conversations. So when I showed this particular Frederick Remington painting, one of my students that I knew to be a truly deep thinker, I said, Matthew Fan, what do you think? And he said, well, I was just thinking about how in King Arthur, Lancelot is falling into sin, and Galahad and Gawain cannot lift him up from it, even though they try. And I looked at him and I was like, I don't have a microphone for you to drop, but we're not going any higher than that. Everybody, this is what I'm wanting. Anyway, so it really struck me and stayed with me, that idea of friendship, that our friends are supposed to help us desire the right things, and that we need to ask ourselves, are our friends doing that, and how does one even do that? How does one help a friend to desire the right things? So in the Christian sense, the most essential thing is mutual self-disclosure and admitting that we're in need of repentance. Father Shirapa last night said, as Christians, we show each other our wounds. That doing so is essential to growing in virtue. It also cements us together. There's an article by Peter Rempel at the Plow magazine. He's talking about disabled people who are in institutional care, and says that what's really challenging for them is that there's like a continuity as they're moved from one facility to another of the medical narrative of these were my treatments and this is what I'm taking and don't, but there's no continuity of their personal narrative. And I like this because at the end he says, to know that we are loved, we must first of all know that we are known. So in the Catholic literary tradition, I think that there are some very clear examples of heroic friendship. I am in no way a Tolkien expert. I am not even clear if I'm pronouncing Tolkien correctly. So this is more like a movie-based level of understanding. But Sam and Frodo are the perfect image of this, especially because Sam's service towards Frodo is rooted in his humility. And if you engage in this, if you study this work with children, it's easy to find lessons here. But I think the message is more and more, well, these are stories, okay, this is wrong, this is not true about Tolkien, I know that, but these are children's stories, I know that's not actually true. But that these types of stories are for children. And then we have like superhero stories, which are also fun versions of hero things, but those are basically for children too. But really, there are no heroes, or the best thing is anti-heroes, and the people you think are heroes, the real cool thing is to find out why they actually are not. And actually that can be a much more exciting narrative, but if these are the stories that we're encountering, how can we still use this virtue friendship lens to examine them? So as I mentioned, I'm going to speak briefly about 3 different books. In the Time of the Butterflies, which I read from a little bit before, to me is the most explicitly a narrative of friends propelling one another towards virtuous action. Alice McDermott was apparently here in October. She's not here in the room, right? Okay, good. Her newest book, I have just forgotten the title, so again, good she's not here. But this book, Charming Billy, is a story of friends trying to help a friend who is struggling with alcoholism and who are unsuccessful among Irish immigrants in the Bronx in the 50s. And then last, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford by Ron Hansen, who's also spoken at Notre Dame a few times. Also not in the room, right? Okay. Well, anyway, I'll get to why I included that one towards the end. So, one of the things that the political philosopher P.E. Digester talks about is that we don't have to have explicit self-disclosure in which we tell each other the types of people that we are, because we reveal ourselves adverbially, meaning in our actions and not only how we treat our friends, but just the types of person that we are, we reveal, even if we don't intend to be disclosing ourselves. And the best way of doing this is living in community. And so, with our friends, we can truly be ourselves. And you can see that there are some delightful things about letting it all hang out. I mean, I look at this and I think, they look pretty secure in their identity. But with that comfort, there's solidarity, but then there's mutual complacency of, you and I, we know the kind of person that we are. We don't need to change. We're great the way that we are. There's really no more adverbial laboratory of revealing ourselves than the family, because you cannot hide who you really are within your home very effectively. My nightmare is that one of my children will write a memoir one day. That doesn't happen. But this book is an excellent example of how, because these four sisters know each other so well, they are able to propel one another to take action, to resist injustice. And I'm going to try not to spoil the books too much, but it's not a spoiler. The three of the sisters were executed by the Trujillo regime, and then their oldest sister lived, and in the book she's like the keeper of the story. And in fact, during the book she's sort of discerning why did I survive, what should I have done, and she comes to realize that's her role here, is to tell their story. Okay, I chose this picture of Saints Peter and Paul in contention to emphasize that even those whom we know to have heroic virtue can disagree about what's the best way to propel to form people in virtue. And that leads to the next novel, Charming Billy, by Alice McDermott. So it opens with, okay, another spoiler, somebody else is dead, Billy's dead at the beginning. But it's like first page. It opens at his wake, and his friends and family are discussing his character, his battle with alcoholism, how, was it a disease? Was this something he chose? Could they have done something differently? And it all comes back to a time when he was young. He and his cousin fell in love with these two Irish sisters, and Ava went back to Ireland, and Billy sent her the money because they were going to get married. He sent her the money for the return trip, and his cousin Dennis explains to him that she died of pneumonia. So the idea is that this was the defining act in his life. Now the novel examines much more after that in his life and the life of the people. But at the beginning, all of his family members are talking about, oh, you know, we all knew Billy. We knew what kind of person he was. He was so charming. He always had a story for people. Oh, he later married his wife. Wasn't she a saint, etc. And at the end of the first chapter, his cousin is in the car leaving the wake with his daughter. And he says, here's the most pathetic part. Ava never died. It was a lie. Just between the two of us, Ava lived. So he got the news that she had taken the money, got married to someone else, and instead of telling Billy the truth, he found it more convenient to just tell him that she died. So he has, you know, it's a cowardly act in some ways because he doesn't want to confront the reality of the situation, but he feels that he's done the right thing. And in the book, we can see sort of the course that this had on Billy's life, this loss of Ava. And last, because I have 2 minutes, excellent timing. How many of you have seen this movie or read the book? Yeah, okay. All right, so I chose this book because of the line that Jesse James says to Robert Ford, I can't tell if you want to be like me or you want to be me. Now, spoilers, in the title, Robert Ford assassinates Jesse James. So, unfortunately, I have not allotted enough time for this awesome embedded YouTube thing, so you don't get to hear Casey Affleck talking about how he's modeled his whole life on all the similarities between himself and Jesse James. But it struck me that it's a perfect warped inversion of this Aristotelian ideal that we see in someone, the virtue that we want to pursue, because he wants to be Jesse James, and it destroys him, and it destroys Jesse James. He's totally consumed. And to me, this was maybe an example of how, okay, we're probably not going to go assassinate bank robbers anytime soon, but if you choose a friend and you make that friend the exemplar, and you say, if I can just be like that person, I will be virtuous, there are many ways that can backfire. maybe like Robert Ford, what we value in the person will actually be a vice. Or maybe we will kind of outsource morality to this person and say, well, I'm just going to do whatever you do and take the responsibility off our own shoulders. Or else we can just be consumed by envy because we see that that person appears to be more successful at whatever the virtue is, and why can't I be like that person? So in closing, I have, I guess, 3 takeaways. First, using art and literature. Oh, I mean, we didn't get to talk about the devil. There's the devil, right? Just avoid it. No devil. First, using art and literature to talk about morality is kind of removing, it's a low stakes way for young people to engage in these conversations without forced sharing of, tell me your story, I just met you, what's your deepest fear? Second, we can use this lens of friendship to examine really any story and find meaning there, even if it's not an explicitly Christian moral arc. And last, I think kids tend to see teleology as like the report card at the end of my life, and prayer is extra credit that I might need it or I might not. We need to understand that if we're not gazing into the eyes of Christ, we cannot execute our duties to our friends. We can't live out our lives in Christian friendship without having that deep engagement with the life of Christ. So thank you very much for your time.
Hey, hello. I'm sorry, I do not have a PowerPoint. I also don't have a printed out talk. So I hope I'm gonna be able to talk while staring at the screen. I also think I'm contractually obligated to mention that I have my novel, the most relevant novel that I wrote, for sale. If you have any cash at all, I'm trying to shed them, so. In this talk, I'm going to try to talk briefly about how several narratives of addiction and recovery, mostly but not only fictional, depict friendship as an arena of moral drama. Among people who care about friendship's place in culture, it's something of a commonplace to say that friendship has been crowded out, especially in pop culture, by sex and romance. Pop music is famously centered on sex and romance. It's rare that a major movie will center on friendship. You're more likely to see a movie about a lady who wants to make it with a fish than one where the narrative centers on the sacrifices of friends for one another. As a side note, I've heard the argument that one major reason for the popularity of procedurals on television and superhero films on the big screen is that these are stories in which groups of coworkers become friends and sacrifice routinely for one another on the basis of that friendship. A kind of story which is otherwise exceptionally hard to find in pop culture. And so it's all the more striking to me how often friendship does play a central role in narratives of addiction and recovery. There are 3 traditional understandings or aspects of friendship which I'd like to explore today. One is that friendship emerges into art primarily in the act of mourning, that the art of friendship is more often than not funerary art. It's no coincidence, this line of thought argues, that both St. Augustine's and St. Aelred's reflections on friendship are shaped around the death of beloved friends, not to mention Montaigne's and Cicero's, which I'm not mentioning because I haven't read them. Second, that friendship is love rooted in similarity, whereas eros is love born of difference. And third, that friendship is love you choose, which is free of entangling obligations and social pressure, a love you give yourself to not from duty, but from delight. The art of addiction and recovery, unsurprisingly, offers a lot of support for the proposition that the art of friendship is a mourner's art. It offers less obvious and more conflicted but real evidence for the idea that friendship is typically the love of one similar to yourself. But it strongly, consistently contradicts the final proposition that friendship is a realm of freedom rather than obligation. Perhaps it is this attention to friendship's duties and their dereliction which makes friendship available as an arena of moral choice in the art of addiction and recovery. I will tell you up front that I am not taking my examples from high art, I picked them because they seem to me to crystallize actual important themes that come up a lot in the art of addiction and recovery, but they're maybe better described as unpopular culture than popular culture. They're mostly just like personal favorites. I will start with an indie pop song from the Canadian band Moxie Fruvis, which is just called Drinking Song. This thing plays out like a rambling, drunken yarn. It's got a chorus that you can sing along to, just like real drinking song, about two ramshackle friends who sit side by side, never quite communicating. They get up from their chaise longue, they fall down. They stand naked on a roof. They ruminate and wage the eternal war against health and sanity, fought with triple distilled troops. They have the kind of adventures which change nothing, and the kind of fun which is almost, but never quite, joyful. They sing together, Irene, good night, Irene, I'll see you in my dreams. And this is as close as they get to like touching a woman. And then one of them doesn't wake up. He says goodbye and then he's gone. And our hero sings, I was so hammered, I sputtered and stammered, told him he couldn't just die. But it turns out that people do what you tell them they can't do all the time. The hints of apocalypse, which have shadowed the song from the beginning, the references to the end and a nuclear dawn, suddenly emerge into shape. The lights of an ambulance, the helicopters that might be the police, the end of everything. The last lines before the final chorus say, I never drank again. Can't really call that a loss or a win. The narrator wears sobriety like a scar. And there's a defiance here which seethes under the surface of a lot of these narratives of friendship with dead people. Against an outside world which might see only wasted lives, which might say you're better off without him. These narrators protest that nothing, not even their own lives and sanity, could ever be worth the death of a friend. The action of Dan Barden's tragicomic neo-noir novel, The Next Right Thing, which I'll have a lot more to say about in a moment, starts because the ex-cop Randy's sponsor dies of an overdose, and Randy thinks he has to find out why. Mary Carr's memoir Lit, like David Carr's memoir, no relation, they're actually spelled differently. David Carr's memoir The Night of the Gun starts with brief sketches of the ones who didn't make it. David Carr even includes a clipped newspaper obituary in case you think he's lying. The album We Shall All Be Healed by the indie band The Mountain Goats gradually chronicles the dissolution of a group of meth-addicted housemates. It includes a harrowing song about watching a team in hazmat suits sort through a dead friend's belongings. The narrator sings in a gentle and almost wistful tone. There's guys in biohazard suits, mud caking on their rubber boots. They've come to keep your pretty things from danger. And he holds that last word, danger, just long enough that you can hear the irony that the pretty things will be protected as the friend never was. The singer is a witness, taking pictures of the scene, and when he says, my camera groans beneath the weight it bears, it's not the camera whose aching misery we feel. The friend's death foreshadows his own confrontation with his addiction later in the album. He sings, a tiger's never gonna change its stripes. I guess, but Jesus, what a mess. He misses the friend who has left only poison behind. He says, I wish you had a number where you are. It's hard with no one here to help me through it. These narratives in which the beloved friend dies proclaim the high stakes of sobriety, but they also witness to the worth of what others may see as worthless lives. They proclaim sameness, proclaim that although one friend died drunk and the other lives sober, they are not so different. The living friend's sobriety is not a victory because to win would separate him from the losing side, which is his friend's side. These forms of mourning are relatively simple. A harder form is the mourning for somebody you know that you failed, or somebody you helped drag down, or somebody you abandoned because he was dragging you down. To me, the most memorable aspect of Augustine Burroughs' memoir, Dry, is his friendship with a man nicknamed Pighead. They loved each other, and it wasn't enough. When Pighead was dying of AIDS, Burroughs stayed away. Pighead left him a bequest, a huge, ugly golden statue of a pig's head, inscribed with the words, I'm watching you, now stop drinking. But instead, under the beady eyes of the pig head, Burroughs relapsed. Writing all that down and publishing it was, I'm guessing, a kind of amends, which, like all amends, never actually makes up for what you did. Sometimes it is the one who's getting better who leaves a friend behind, and the loss is the loss of parting rather than death. The best portrayal of that dynamic I know is the 1987 film Withnail and I. In this, I guess, comedy, two friends leave their disgusting, squalid London apartment, and as one of them later wails, go on holiday by mistake. They end up in the country, which solves nothing. They're menaced by bulls and poachers and a lustful uncle. From the very beginning of the movie, we can guess that Withnail, played with shambolic charisma by Richard E. Grant, is the more deeply addicted of the two and more of a professional failure. And yet the movie is a tribute to him. It's a backhanded tribute. It's a justification for why people like Withnail get abandoned by the friends that they love. But it's also his movie. The best friend, who's also the narrator, never even gets named. I'm going to call him Marwood later because the script calls him Marwood, but in both the title of the movie and in all the dialogue, you never actually hear his name. The film closes on Withnail, and its final scene gives him the one thing he's admitted that he wants, which is a chance to play Hamlet, though his only audience is a pack of dogs. The drama of the film comes from wondering how much Withnail will get away with, and whether Marwood will stick with him against all of his better instincts. I mean, like, if the rat really cared about the sinking ship, would he stay? This is sort of the drama of Withnail and I. There are certain obvious ways in which these friendships are born of sameness rather than difference. The pairs of friends are usually same-sex, like the two gnarly dudes in the Moxie Fruvis song, or Withnail and other guy, whose anonymity, by the way, emphasizes both his difference from Withnail and his sameness. He lives in Withnail's shadow, and also to a certain extent, by losing his own name in the narrative, kind of becomes a shadow of Withnail. The friends share the same drugs of choice. They are similar enough that one friend's disaster can spur the other friend to sobriety. As Andrew Sullivan writes in his essay on friendship in the shadow of the AIDS crisis, which is called If Love Were All, it's in his book Love Undetectable, if you want to read it. It is only perhaps when you absorb the notion that someone is truly your equal, truly interchangeable with you, that the death of another makes mortality real. It is as if it is only in the death of a friend that a true reckoning with mortality is ever made before it is too late. In these narratives of addiction, the mourner is also grieving for the person he could have been and the death he could have had, maybe even the death he wishes he'd had. There is also a subtler contrast between friendship and eros in these narratives. The role of mystical beloved, longed for, obsessed over, trysted with in secret, is played by alcohol. Drugs and alcohol are transcendent, mysterious, withholding, unattainable, whereas the friend is imminent and probably trying to kick you awake right now. Friendship is only real life, everyday or ordinary life, whereas alcohol is the life you were made for, the life you have never quite experienced, yet always feel that you have lost. There is a mysticism of friendship which St. Aelred expresses most beautifully, a friendship which is like a kiss, like a surrender, like Christ himself. But in most of these narratives, it is alcohol, not friendship, which is the realm of the mystical, and therefore the erotic. And I have to admit, I didn't quite know where to like jam this into the already sort of crazy structure of this talk. But one recurring theme in the literature of friendship is the transparency of friends to one another, which has already come up with, maybe with both people. I could tell her anything, friends say. St. Aelred emphasizes that friends must be totally trustworthy because you will entrust to them all your secrets. Andrew Sullivan writes of the friend whose death prompted the beautiful essay I quoted earlier, I remember how hard it was to lie to him or not to tell him everything. The Next Right Thing, that neo-noir novel, repeatedly returns to the image of the fifth step, in which an alcoholic shares his or her resentments, fears, and sins with one other person within the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. The fifth step resolves the novel's plot and themes, but also more deeply serves in the novel as a kind of sacrament of friendship. I'll get to a little more about that in a moment. I want to say the structure of that novel is in a strange way because it begins with the unexpected overdose of the main character's sponsor in AA. He ends up performing almost like a coercive fifth step of investigating this dead person's life and trying to find out why this all happened. he suddenly has revealed to him a huge, shocking secret about someone to whom he had voluntarily revealed all of his own most sordid secrets earlier. And there's a lot of, I think, deep emotional conflict in him about whether what he's doing really makes sense or will help. But it's clearly propelled by that friendship, by that need for mutual transparency, for mutual knowing. If friendship, even more than marriage, is the realm not of self-sacrificing privacy, but of self-exposing honesty, then friendship must be a necessary component of any drama of recovery. Last, I'm not going to go over, I think. Last but most, we turn to the idea that friendship is a realm of choice and freedom. St. Aelred emphasizes that one must test potential friends and extend friendship only to those who prove that they can bear it. Andrew Sullivan, again, describes the classical philosophical ideal of friendship this way. A virtuous man comes to a friend in exactly the opposite way that a lover comes to his beloved. He comes not out of need or passion or longing. He comes out of a radical choice. In a utilitarian world, Sullivan writes, friendship is useless in the best sense of the word. And once the friend is chosen, there are no scripts, we make no promises, we pledge no troth, there are no actual sacraments, there's no kind of list of duties that you promise to do. We are friends for as long as both of us choose to be. There's nothing we have to do, and no time we have to serve. All of that is turned on its head in narratives of addiction and recovery. Here, friendship is the site of moral drama because it is unchosen, because it has duties which you can fulfill or shirk, and because you need it as you have never needed anything since the day you were weaned. Friendship is unchosen in most narratives of addiction. You just kind of like black out, and when you come to, you have these friends. We never learn how Withnell met Marwood, or the two friends in the drinking song, or the group of meth-addicted friends in the Mountain Goats album, or the women who I cut from this because I thought I would run out of time, who also sometimes appear in narratives of addiction. Friendship is the site of moral drama in these stories because it has to be dealt with somehow. It can't be simply walked away from without scars. These people's friendships work in the narrative, sort of like the unplanned pregnancy in Juno. Now you have this person inside your life. What are you going to do about it? You can shirk your duties to your friend, as Augustine Burroughs depicts himself shirking his duties to Pighead. You can leave your friend and try to figure out if that was all right, if that was necessary. Or you can take on new duties in sobriety with people who are your friends because they are like you. David Carr gives a poignant example of this when he talks about his friendship with Jason Blair. They were both working at the New York Times, and Blair resigned in disgrace after admitting that he'd adulterated his reporting with plagiarism and like actual fiction. At a time when their coworkers could only see Blair as a Judas and a failure, Carr saw him as a fellow addict in need and therefore as a friend. The writer Helen Andrews noted that nowadays, even some people who have never experienced addiction have what she calls AA envy. I think that's right. I suspect one aspect of this envy is related to friendship. The ideal, if not always the real, sponsor in AA is a kind of army issue friend, not the friend you would have chosen for yourself, a little too one-size-fits-all, not chic or charming, but sturdy. You can get the friend you need and don't deserve, and all you have to do is admit that you are a helpless failure. Dan Barden's novel, again, The Next Right Thing, is all about this ideal of sponsorship as friendship. I read it first in early sobriety and then just revisited it for this conference, and now I love it. I love this book. It is such a consoling read. It's hard-boiled. He's working hard with the noir conventions, but very forgiving. The anti-hero, Randy, begins the novel in this bad state of mind, whereas he says, "You're too lonely to talk to your friends." These are his friends of necessity, whom he met in the rooms of AA. They're your friends because you're like them, even if they don't actually like you. Randy's sponsor, whose fatal overdose sparks the novel's plot, frequently emphasizes that he doesn't like Randy much, but he needs Randy. He needs to, by which he means he needs to serve Randy in order to stay sober. This need is messy and sad, right? And it saves Randy's life. And slowly it emerges that I don't like you very much is how these tough guy AA types say, I love you. When people in this novel say, I want you to be my sponsor, seriously, you feel like they should be on one knee holding up a ring. In a world where friend is a word more strongly associated with Facebook than with Christ, Randy struggles to explain his relationship to his potential sponsee, Troy. Some cops first think Troy is his son, and when Randy says, no, he's not my son, they're like, your boyfriend? Randy resorts to comparing them to Batman and Robin, as if this will clarify things. Outside AA, there's no word for what they are to one another. Everything Randy does in this novel, from breaking a guy's nose to building a crib, is motivated by friendship. A friendship of need, a friendship of duty, a friendship which can be criminal and stupid and destructive, and still remains somehow rooted in love and the desperate desire to act better than you are. When this is friendship, how can it not be a site of moral drama? And here's that turn that you always have to do in these things. This is what friendship is in the Gospels. Not a radically free choice, but a response of gratitude to Jesus' love for us in our helpless failure. This is friendship where Peter, who is way up in his feelings as always, cuts off the ear of the high priest slave Malchus because he thinks that might help his friend. It's a friendship where Jesus dies stripped and criminal to save his friends from spiritual death.
Sorry, I said a bad word.
I think you deserve it.
So, we've got about 7 minutes for questions. Wow, that was a big fall. Thanks.
Do you want to get that microphone? Oh, sorry.
In the literature of addiction, especially in recovering addiction with friendship, is there any conception of moving towards a common goal, presumably some sort of recovery or something like that?
Yeah, well, and in fact, I meant to say this and then totally forgot. I think I did go over it anyway, so I'm sorry. There is one of the interesting things about the Next Right Thing is that although the novel is so much structured around friendship, the friend, and it is I think really a virtue friendship, but the virtue is not practiced by really either of the friends throughout as you see them. It is nonetheless the ideal that they are, the reason they're together is to work toward this ideal, even though it's embodied by something outside the friends. I will say, though, too, of course, there's a lot of narratives addiction that are more about the friend as tempter or the sort of downward spiral together kind of thing. But certainly in narratives of recovery, it's pretty common to find an open acknowledgement that the friends themselves are not living virtuously, and yet they're still managing to attempt a virtue friendship, and sort of the hypocrisies and complications that causes.
All three can answer, or one or two. There seems to be an obstinate addiction to ordinary language, to digital language. So how do you get children or young adults or even people like me at 56 to turn off their phones and re-engage and be better citizens and better philosophers and better, does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted approach. You could come to Oklahoma, where I live, where everything's backwards. So that's step one. You just go where there's not really great internet connection, and then you have to deal with that stuff. No, in a more serious light, I think that starts to be an interesting question about, the digital. So one thing that I know that people were immediately fighting with me, my friends, when I was going to talk about this, is they go, well, books and loving books is a rather modern thing, right? This is all post-Gutenberg. And, I noticed, I was like, I did put books. And then in this limited 20 minutes, I was like, should I point out stories? And it doesn't have to be books and all these things like this. There is always going to be an attendant reality to the medium we spread stories in. So going from an oral culture to a written one, going to bound books easily bought, for instance, after this talk, to the immediacy of the digital age. All of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. So I think whatever response we have, it can't be digital bad, just like it would be silly to imagine someone, really trashing Gutenberg as if it caused all problems. But certainly it changes how the world is. I think that goes back to saying the burden is on us who believe in friendship's importance to figure out how to reach people and let them realize that there's something deeper in a friendship that's character-based instead of use and pleasure, and that there's something that no medium can capture about that. But yeah, certainly the digital one, because of its sort of speed or anonymity, it can make it harder for students to sort of naturally see that. But I just don't want to blame all of that on the digital revolution. I think there's a lot that we do to make friendship seem difficult to students.
I have always excused my addiction to pop culture as I need to know this to connect with the kids. But I think that if it's something that you yourself enjoy, having some ambient awareness of what they're talking about shows they're always pleasantly, I'm not going to say pleasantly, but they're always surprised when an adult of the mom generation knows what something is to which they're referring. But I think the key is just showing a personal investment in that unique person. I don't know if you were thinking in like a catechetical sense or just in general.
I was just thinking in general, when I listen to my daughter's, who's in her 20s, her friends or their discussions, yes, some are very educated and very intellectual and lovely, but I also sense like a solitariness or a remoteness, an addiction to anonymity or an addiction to, or which causes them loneliness, or also do you read, so you're not alone. Like I look at my love of literature and I think, at times in my life, it has helped me tremendously. So I look at just our culture, the toxicity of our culture, and think this could be a way to help them. That they might not even see the pathway. Or I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, and I guess the argument for me is I actually think that it's a symptom and not the cause. I don't think digital media and the internet have caused us to be lonely. I think we're lonely. And so then we approach this extremely powerful new medium in the way that we do, stemming from our loneliness. I mean, you can also be a dork and listen to Aristotle for 5 hours because of the internet. You have stuff, you can read Aristotle at the drop of a whim. I forgot a book, and thanks to weird Star Trek device that I have in my hand, the cell phone, I could read that as I'm walking up here. So, there's more literature available now because of it. So the reason I think it's not that necessarily the digital realm is why we're lonely. We're profoundly lonely for very deep philosophical reasons. And so then it makes a lot of sense why we deal with digital media the way we do, I think.
I think we can do, was there one more back here? Yeah, we'll do one more.
Well, I was just going to add, I think this is more directed for you from the first talk, but, and I have both Derrida and Foucault kind of in the background for this question, but is there a way that we can do violence to our literature friends, that would damage the friendship and damage then, not just the friendship, but the literature itself?
No, I like that because I was thinking this in terms of that we owe honor to our ancestors, if that what it means. So, you're teaching kids and then they're like, well, what's the right interpretation? Especially, God bless them, with Catholic kids. And so I tried to tell them, like, well, what you want is sort of like a consumerist answer like everyone wants. We want the Marxist read or the Catholic read, or we want this read. And I'm always trying to say it should be flipped, right? We don't data mine the book. The book reads us. You try to give Zen mantras like that to 14-year-olds because what else are you going to do with your life? But all that is to say, when I get down to it, what I try to say is, with interpretations of stories, it's more about can this story bear the weight of your interpretation? And so then I find myself again humanizing it, right? Are we loading too much onto this story where it can't bear what you want to put on it? And so Foucault or Derrida or any of the sort of postmodernists that talk about, the power that we can do by, marshaling language as a sort of, this is more Heidegger, a standing reserve. It goes to your point that if we have a relationship of honor towards the book or the person or whatever it might be, that we might start to be careful with words that way, that we go, we owe something to the book to not do with it whatever we want. But then that's also depends on how you want to use it. Because on the other hand, the biblical, like you have a theologian in the Middle Ages that every fourth word is from the Bible, just because it's like so deeply, and so like you can look at that and go like, oh, they're proof texting. But I mean, I'm a convert. I grew up Southern Baptist, and I'm not even trying to cast too many aspersions this way, but you can tell a difference between eisegesis and then the difference between someone who naturally speaks with that idiom, that it's not proof texting, even though it can seem that way. And I'm going to run on, so I hope that answered it a little bit. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
Can I just ask one more of all three of you? What was the book that you reflect back on that's changed your life?
One?
Yes, one. And it doesn't have to be the book, like the intellectual book. And if I named the book that I would tell you, you would think that was really dumb. But it was like a cultural class. It changed how I looked at the world and then set me on a literature trajectory. So it doesn't have to be, Aristotle or Plato. It's a book. Like, what do you think of your own life? Or even as an adult, like what?
For me, it was Walker Percy's The Thanatos Syndrome, which is a weird one to start with for Walker Percy. And I was a high school senior and in the Deep South in like super country club WASP world and feeling like an alien as a Catholic. And I read that book and I was like, oh my gosh, anyway. And it just started a lifelong interest in Percy. And related to that, in 20 seconds, I just want to tell you, I do see digital life as uniquely challenging. And I think that the personal branding that we demand of children, of constantly presenting a curated narrative for other people to consume, I think is unique, and I think it's very dangerous. Okay, anyway, hi, E.
Sure, The Man Without a Country. This is I want to say 19th century short little thing. It's about a guy who gets exiled from the United States after getting mixed up with Aaron Burr, which apparently you should never do. And it was written to make kids patriotic. It didn't actually do that with me. It's the clearest representation that I found as a child of what I would later, after conversion, come to recognize as kind of existential exile or the fall, the exile from Eden.
Mine was, I read the apology and I read the part where it goes like, what the philosopher does is the gadfly that bites the steed in the rear end to wake him up. And I was like, you can be a professional pain in the ass? And then that's what I've been doing ever since.
All right, that's a perfect end to our panel.